I want to thank to the Patriarchate of Moscow for the invitation they have done to me to speak about the criteria to distinguish between a mystical phenomenon and a mental disease. I do not want to begin my intervention without showing my deep respect for the Orthodox Church. I am Catholic, but I recognize with deep respect the way they have preserved the purity of the faith and the beauty of their liturgical tradition. In this world of relativism, that everything is placed into question, the way the bishops, the monks, and the priests of the Orthodox churches, the way they have maintained the treasure of faith is something that we respect and admire in a very, very deep way. Having said that, I go to my field. Voices, internal voices, external voices. How to distinguish what is pathological than the supernatural. How to distinguish falsehood and a true intervention from God. First of all, we have to consider that God has the right to surprise us. It is clear that some cases, in a very manifest way, they are just a pathology. Just with common sense, it is very manifest. Everything comes from the mind, from a mind that is not thinking in the right way, a mind that is creating images, that is creating voices. Many individuals with schizophrenic problems, they have a pathology with a religious topic. That is very common. But at the same time, we believe in God, we accept the possibility God speaks to a person. It is true that if God gives us a message, He will use an instrument that we may rely on Him. God will not choose an instrument that, because his spiritual life, because of his sins, because he is lying, he is full of lust, he is robbing, we cannot rely on him. God is who chooses the instruments. And people, it's difficult to believe a message from God, but it will be more difficult if the instrument is unworthy. The message and the instrument to give that message has to be in a relationship that is reasonable, because God is a God of reason, and God always works in a reasonable way. At the same time, what I said at the beginning, the mystery of God is something that goes farther than we think. It's something that goes farther than our plans, our thoughts. God has not to submit himself to our poor ways of thinking. Then we have to approach always to discern a case with humility. Many cases will be clear from the beginning. This is something that is a sick person. Other cases are very clear. He has done miracles. He is a clear prophet from God. His holiness is completely out of any doubt. But there is in the middle some cases that are not so clear to be something pathological, or so clear to say this is a prophet from God. His holiness, we have no doubt about that. They're in the middle. But in some cases, but with the time, most of the cases are clear. With the time, finally we discover they began to say more and more things that are completely out of reason. That is a way a person out of his mind that he is speaking. Other cases with the time, their holiness is becoming more clear. But always at the beginning, we have to admit we need time. It's not just a question of criteria. It's not just a question of how good I am discerning. For some cases, time is needed. And with the time, will flourish what it has to flourish. Pathology or holiness. Sometimes it's a need of months, other times even more than a year. Because there are cases that are in the very middle, and it's a mixture of a great spiritual life of an individual that has a mental problem. A person with a mental problem may have a true, wonderful spiritual life of sacrifice, of prayer, but the organ that is in his head is working in a bad way, is creating images or messages. At the same time, always we have to consider that God may surprise us. We are speaking about the invisible, the immaterial. It's not something that has to be judged by a psychiatrist. Psychiatrists may judge very well if the global way we see that person is normal or is pathological. It is true that the psychiatrist may judge very well in a global way this is a sick person. But when we consider exactly a message of somebody that it seems to be normal, that has a normal life in his family, in his work, then it's something mystical that has to be judged by any spiritual person. And any spiritual person will have experience, will have a knowledge that is not learned by books, is learned by the experience of the progression of a spiritual life. Sometimes the most spiritual person will not understand the ways of God or why God may do such a thing. Then humility is the first condition for a good discernment. With humility, we do not take judgment very fast. It will come, the judgment, when it's clear and every time is becoming more clear. Because it's like the sun when it's rising. More time is more clear. At the very beginning, perhaps in the twilight, it's not very clear if it's going down or rising. But if he rises, with the time it will become more clear. If the reason of a person is sinking, with the months, it will be more clear that the reason of that person is sinking. If the holiness of that person is rising, with some months, it will become more clear. But when somebody sees the beginning of the day, the lights may be very confusing. Because if just we see a moment, we do not see if it's the twilight of the beginning of the day, of holiness, or if the twilight of the beginning of the night of the reason. It is time when everything becomes clear. The lights and the clouds in the twilight sometimes are very, very confusing in colors, in intensity, and everything. Sometimes there are valleys or mountains that make us not to see with clarity. It's the same with a person. Sometimes there are obstacles, and sometimes personal obstacles of the priest that is judging that person, that those obstacles make not to see clear. The person that has to discern the truth about a nun or about a wife with children, if she has visions of God, the judge has to acknowledge that he will have obstacles. Only very pure, holy individuals, they have no obstacles. The rest of the people, we have prejudices, we have prejudgments, we have schemes in our minds. And perhaps this case will change my way of thinking about other mystical cases. It is a great parallelism between cases that has to be discerned about demonical problems, demonical possession and so on, demonical influences and mystical individuals. Many people, they think it's very easy to judge about demonical cases because they will walk in a wall, or they will have levitation, or he will know all my sins in detail. That happens very, very rarely. The judgment about a demonical case, it has to be considered in a global way. We have to consider how this person is working, how he has a family life, to speak with him. Sometimes we need time. I will pray for you every week with some blessings, but come here every week and we will see. Time is needed to judge sometimes a demonical case. Other cases are very clear from the very beginning. It's a pure, spectacular case of demonical possession. There are some cases. But other cases will be judged not by one or two criteria, but with the contemplation of the whole person during time, and the reaction and the improvement to the prayers. It is the same for the mystical cases. What it is true for discernment demonical cases, it is true for the reverse field, the mystical cases. We have reason. Common sense always is the best ground to achieve a final judgment. But when we rely on one criteria or two criteria, we do not acknowledge the richness of the mystical field, or the richness of the varied phenomena of demonical cases. Most of the demonical cases will not have any spectacular phenomena, and it will be judged just with common sense and faith and experience, acknowledging demonical phenomena, demonical individuals they suffer from demonical influences, is what it is, not what we thought it was. Always when an exorcist is a point for a diocese, he has his ideas. With experience, he will discover the demonical field is what it is, not what we thought it was. Always we thought something more spectacular, something more clear, something that never could be mixed with mental pathologies. But sometimes an individual with demonical problems, he will need exorcist and sometimes a psychiatrist, because there is a deformation of his psychology. Prayers, but also somebody that advise and treat that person in a long term, because his life, his sins has deformed his psychology. In the case of the mystical individuals, usually we can be sure that no mental pathology is in somebody if he is receiving messages from God. It could not be reasonable to mix mental problems with messages from God. If a person with a mental problem has one day a message from God, God will understand that we do not believe him. But sometimes some messages, some kind of little mystical life will be mixed with some defects. Of course, more holiness make us to believe more in a message. But we have in the Bible cases of prophets, Jonah, for example, that he has some personal moral problems of resisting God, and at the same time he has a true prophet. I finish my intervention just pointing that we understand that the mystery of God is far beyond the strength, the capability of our minds. Then we have to understand that his message can go farther than we thought. Because the message, it is in direct relationship with the person that gives the message. And mystical phenomena is something that is an expression of God. The humility we have before God, we have to maintain with a messenger from God. That doesn't mean that I will believe a person that say to me, I have a message from the very beginning. No. The suspension of judgment is what we have to do until we arrive to a final decision. More than a decision, a judgment, because judgment is not a question of decision, it's a question of see with clarity. And the respect for the person that is before us is very important. Sometimes we arrive to discern like a boss to somebody that is subjected to me. We approach a person with a superiority that is a true obstacle to be open to the freedom of a God that is revealing to somebody. Nothing more. I finished my intervention thinking that a spiritual person, holy person, is always the best for making a final judgment that is never a fruit of decision. It's holiness that identifies holiness. Is the person in relationship with God that will recognize the intervention of God in other person. And never, no. Very often it cannot be done just in a conversation of even 1 hour or 2 hours. Time is needed, and sometimes a good, poor, simple pastor will achieve a final judgment of a person through observation than a more wise person that will see somebody just in 1 hour or 2 hours. The good Lord has given manifestation of His holiness in this world, and He uses the ways He has used in the Bible. And we can see strange cases like Balaam in the book of Numbers, or strange cases that appear in the life of Elijah. The Bible will be always the best manual to see how complex sometimes is that relationship between the extraordinary when manifest in this world. Thank you for hearing me.